I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to Slee Rickets. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Thanks to all the new listeners, and thanks even more to all of the old listeners. If you like the show, then maybe take a moment sometime this week to recommend it to somebody you think might enjoy it, or at least somebody who you think might have a good argument with you about it after listening to a single 3-minute segment. If you are tired of waiting for new episodes to come out every week and you'd like to hear more, then you can go to sleerickets.substack.com and subscribe to The Secret Show. There are 7 episodes up there already. I misnumbered the last one, and there are more coming out all the time. You can sign up for just a couple bucks, $2.50 a month, if you do the annual plan, or if you're rich, you can sign up for the rich person plan. But either way, there's a range, and if money is a problem, then just let me know, and we'll figure something out. I would rather have listeners. Also, I have not mentioned in a while the whole iTunes rating nonsense, because I still don't understand what that ends up meaning. But I did notice, just so you're informed, I did notice I recently got my very first 4-star rating. I'd previously gotten only 5-star ratings and then a single 1-star rating from my dad, who did not know how to use his phone. But the 4 versus 5-star war has commenced. So if you'd like to log in and register your judgment on either end, you are certainly welcome to, or start a new front on the behind the 3-star barricades. In any case, thank you as always for listening. I've got a really good show this week. My guest is, at long last, Andrew Palmer, a novelist who published the really terrific book The Bachelor with, I think, Houghton Mifflin. I'm not sure. I have a link to it in the show notes, and this is a book that it is a very funny book about very smart people making very foolish decisions. It is crammed with love triangles, with weirdly poignant meditations on reality TV, and it even contains juicy gossip about the life of John Berryman. So basically, it was engineered in a lab for the pleasure of Slee Rickets co-host Alice Allen. I'm so confident that Alice will just gobble this book up that I've actually already ordered her a copy. And since I sprang for the Australian priority mail, I ordered it last Saturday, which means it should get there in just 6 to 8 months. Andrew joined me to talk about Keep the Aspidistra Flying, George Orwell's 1936 novel about failing/failed poet Gordon Comstock. It is a very funny, very biting novel, and Andrew and I had a lot of fun discussing it. We had also talked a little bit about his novel, The Bachelor, as well as his time producing the Writer's Almanac for Garrison Keillor. So we get into that a little bit at the end. Andrew also had a pretty entertaining rant about the recent wrongness of other Slee Rickets co-host Brian Platzer. So that, I didn't want this episode to go too long, so I am going to save that for The Secret Show in another goodie bag episode coming up soon. If you would like a preview of the most recent Secret Show episode, just stay listening at the end of the episode today, and there will be a little excerpt that I think you will like. This was a really good one. Alice just sort of took charge and grilled me on the topic of dishonesty in the contemporary poetry world, and we got pretty deep in the weeds. I think it was a good episode. I hope you will enjoy it, and if you listen to the end of this episode, you will hear a little excerpt from that. Right now, let's get to my conversation with Andrew Palmer, author of The Bachelor. The protagonist, Gordon Comstock, he has published one totally obscure book of poems. Although, like, there's obscure and there's obscure, because, like, in 1936, he was like, oh, he'd only gotten 13 reviews,
13
including
reviews.
one at the Times Literary Supplement.
Right. The Times Literary Supplement blurb comes up over and over again, and it's like a poet of excellent promise or something like that. But he's also gotten 13 other reviews. I mean, can you imagine a book of poetry, any book of poetry today getting 13 reviews? Maybe the two or three, like most...
The hottest ones. I mean, like, that was the Ada Limon thing. She had like 13 reviews. If that. She probably had like 9 reviews, but yeah.
Right. I mean, for a novel, that's an extraordinary amount of reviews today. For a book of poetry, it struck me as just, astounding.
I mean, it must just be because there is a lot of talk in the book about trashy literature, and it still seems to be like the entertainment of the working class. Like, they're buying, renting novels to read rather than, so, like, I guess you're not competing with TV is really the key. But still, like, poetry's doing pretty well.
Really well, it seems. The other great thing about Gordon Comstock's first book is its title, which is just Mice.
Yeah. Mice, and then to be followed up by the never finished sequel, London Pleasures.
Which is yeah.
So he is working on this book length poem, London Pleasure, or would be book length poem, London Pleasures. He's working in a crummy bookstore that we find out later is not as crummy as a bookstore can get. It's like, it looks nice in retrospect when he moves on to an even crummier bookstore.
Yes.
He's got a girlfriend who won't sleep with him for various reasons. He's got one sort of friend who's an editor of a sort of ridiculous magazine called Antichrist.
Yes, like a quasi-socialist magazine.
He has a great
literary magazine.
Description here. He says, Antichrist was a middle to highbrow monthly, socialist in a vehement but ill-defined way. In general, it gave the impression of being edited by an ardent nonconformist who had transferred his allegiance from God to Marx, and in doing so had got mixed up with a gang of Verlieb poets. Pretty damning, like, for magazines I know today.
Yeah, I thought of you when I read that. Imagine the delight you would take in that description.
Yeah. So I do, like, he basically, like, most of the book, it just concerns him not having enough money to do anything that he wants to do, and then like eventually getting a tiny bit of money, and it's total catastrophe for him. So his life just sort of gets subtly worse and worse, and then dramatically worse.
Well, it's sort of a tiny bit of money. Just to harp on that one element.
Clarify that.
Well, he finally gets a poem accepted in an American literary magazine.
Yeah.
Is it the California Review? Something like that.
Something in California, yeah.
And I'm pretty sure it's one poem, and he gets paid $50 for this poem, which in today's money is probably about like $1,000 or something like that. Like, it's a lot of money for a poem, definitely.
Yeah.
And he certainly imagines that this money will last him quite a while, and he'll be able to afford a lot of stuff that he wasn't able to afford before.
Exactly.
But he blows it all in one sort of tragic night, and then you can continue with your summary of the the story.
And that night, further leaves him further debased and demoralized. Although his friend and his girlfriend stick by him with admirable loyalty through a pretty disgraceful display.
Yes.
So the ending, I have like so many thoughts and feelings about. So before we get to that, though, I'm just kind of curious. I mean, it's a book about poetry that spends almost all of its time, or it's a book about a poet that spends almost all of its time agonizing over money. And like even the epigraph is that famous passage from 1 Corinthians 13, love is patient, love is kind. I mean, that whole passage, it's like a paragraph long that's read at weddings. But basically throughout, it's all in praise of love, or in some translations, charity. But in Orwell's novel, the word love is replaced at every instance with the word money.
Yes.
So, it ends, and now abideth faith, hope, money, these three. But the greatest of these is money.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. From at least most of the novel, and I want to get to that ending too, because it's really interesting. But for most of the novel, what Gordon Comstock explicitly thinks, and what I think the novel itself seems to be arguing as well, is that he says at one point there are two ways to live. You can either be rich, or you can deliberately refuse to be rich. Mm-hmm. So you can sort of like embrace this money world, or you can reject it wholesale. You know, in my experience, those are not exactly the only two ways to live as a writer in the world. I think that there's a sort of like middle way where you can sort of acknowledge the absurdity and ugliness of, you know, whatever late stage capitalism, or the sort of decaying capitalism that Orwell talks about. You can sort of acknowledge that, you know, even be upset by it, and also choose to participate in it partly, while also like figuring out a way to maintain some sort of artistic literary life. For Gordon Comstock, that doesn't seem to be a possibility.
Yeah. So, I mean, because what has already happened before the beginning of the novel is that he comes from a kind of a respectable but like struggling family, and he's gotten all teed up as like the one person in his family who got a real education. Like the rest of his family really sacrificed to get him a decent education. He's all set up with what's considered a good job, which is writing. Or he's working for the New Albion, which is an advertising firm, and he ultimately gets to where he would be writing copy, and he shows some promise at it, and then quits. And he quits, as you said, to spurn the money god, which is how he's obsessed with the money god that dictates, you know, every aspect of their lives around them. And he's obsessed with, like, obviously with the money in his pocket, but also with like the horrible advertisements on the street, and the money everybody must spend on all the things around them, and as well as like the connections and the opportunities that lots of people have sort of invisibly because they come from money. And he talks about like the people who end up having the prestigious writing posts in various periodicals, basically due to their education, you know, which more or less means money. The thing that I wonder about with him, because he seems to be living, you know, like at first blush, he's so miserable. He's so unhappy, and he hates everybody around him so much.
Yes.
But there is, at least initially, I kind of thought, okay, well, he's really decided to make sacrifices such that he can just devote his life to poetry. But it's so hard for him to get any poetry writing done, partly because it's like he's cold, he's hungry, he doesn't have enough cigarettes, he is sexually frustrated, he feels humiliated. Like he doesn't seem to be able to give much of himself to poetry despite making all these sacrifices for it. And it made me think, like, well, was the New Albion, you don't get the impression that like that would have taken so much more of his time than the bookstore job does. But I do think, like, he does say at one point, he makes a distinction between, like, he says basically, like, what you don't want a good job, because with a good, like, you want a dead end job, a blind alley job, as he calls it. Like, the thing about the bookstore is, like, you're not going to go anywhere from there. You don't really have to do much. You can kind of turn your brain off, and all you really need to do is sort of be respectable looking enough that when, like, the posh customers come in, they feel good about going into the bookstore they're going into. Whereas I guess with the New Albion job, if he were to really write copy and really get ahead in the business world, he would have to think about it. Like he couldn't turn his brain off. He would have to devote himself to it. And maybe that's the difference.
Well, and I think maybe as much as that in Gordon's mind, he would have to sort of sell his soul to even participate at all in the sort of PR world. It's hard to talk about all this without talking about the ending. Should we fast forward really quick?
Do you want to give an account of the? So he has this night where he blows all his money. He gets horribly drunk. He offends everybody. He ends up hiring a prostitute whom he's not even physically able to sleep with, but he causes a big mess. He blacks out, hits a cop, wakes up in jail, and basically loses his job, is disgraced, and ends up living with his rich friend Ravelston for, it's like a couple weeks at this point, isn't it?
At least, yeah.
Yeah. His girlfriend sticks by him, Rosemary, despite it all, and he finally eventually is able to squeak into an even shittier bookstore job at a little lending library owned by a a repugnant and like maybe vaguely anti-Semitic caricature named Cheeseman.
Yeah, for sure.
Where he makes like substantially less than his last job where he made very little, and there's no dignity at all to it. It's everything is grubby and awful as it can possibly be. So why don't you pick up there and
sure. And he also moves into an apartment that's even worse than the terrible apartment where he's been living for the first 75% of the book. It's this, just this tiny, like insect infected, extremely cold, decaying apartment on the top floor of a building.
Crucially for plot reasons, and it's a clever thing because it's such a he goes through such a fall at this moment in the book, but then importantly, it's so undignified. It's such a shithole that nobody minds if he brings a girl up.
Yes,
like that's right. Because for much of the book, there's been a lot of trouble with it. He and his sort of infinitely patient girlfriend maybe are going to have sex and almost have sex and can't have sex, and so much of it has to do with, as he says, the time and the place problem.
Right, they can't have sex in his apartment, and so they go off into the country, and they're about to have sex, and what happens so that they can't have sex?
So he starts to go for it, and she's scandalized because, and I had to look this up because I wasn't sure initially.
Right.
And it, like the way it's written in the book, and like coming from our age, I thought this, like for a second I thought it was like a Catholic girl technical virginity thing, but I think the idea is ultimately it becomes clear that he wasn't going to use a contraception, and for her, she can't get pregnant just for not even social reasons, just financial reasons. It's not feasible, and so she won't have sex with him without contraception. She then sort of offers to, he's really awful to her. He's really horrible to her. But they for all these reasons, they don't end up having sex until finally he's in this horrible roach infested hotel at the end.
Right. And she is, like you said, able to come and go as she pleases because no one cares. And Gordon has sort of separated himself from her. He doesn't answer her letters. His only desire is, as he puts it, to sink down into the mud. Like he's turning his face away from everything and everyone. Like remarkably and implausibly, Rosemary, like you said, sticks with him and continues to write letters to him. Eventually comes to visit him in his apartment. They have a very sort of sad interaction, and then she takes off all her clothes, lies down in bed, and says, "Let's have sex," and they do, and it's really sort of awful.
Yeah, it's it's totally depressing.
Hold on one sec. There's a helicopter going over my head.
Okay. Yeah. I'll just read quickly. There's a passage toward that part of the book where Orwell says, "He liked to think that beneath the world of money there is that great sluttish underworld where failure and success have no meaning. A sort of kingdom of ghosts where all are equal. That was where he wished to be, down in the ghost kingdom, below ambition." And that is where he more or less ends up until Rosemary comes to intervene. So
she comes to intervene. They have sex. She leaves. He's in poverty and despondent until a few weeks later he hears again from Rosemary, and she is pregnant. And this changes everything all of a sudden for Gordon in his mind. He thinks, maybe it wouldn't be such a bad idea to work at this PR firm after all. He is able to get the job back. He moves in with Rosemary into a sort of shabby but respectable middle-class apartment. Mm-hmm. They get married, and apparently his attitude towards money, which is defined the first 95% of the novel, has taken a complete 180. He's more or less fine with it. He throws away the draft of London Pleasures, the long poem that he's been working on for the past 2 years, and goes off to live with Rosemary and their baby happily ever after.
Yeah, it's kind of an odd ending line. It says, "Well, once again, things were happening in the Comstock family." Because family has sort of fallen off, and the thought for much of the book is that he's kind of going to be the end of the line as far as the name. His one sister is not going to marry, and he's shriveling up into a June bug shell. And so at the end, finally, things are happening. The family is not going into the dark entirely. So, and we should say also the title "Keep the Aspidistra Flying" is a sort of joke. The line that it is playing off of is "Keep the colors flying" or "Keep the flag flying" as a kind of a patriotic expression of or feeling of expression of patriotism for the British flag. The aspidistra is a hardy indoor plant that apparently, according to Wikipedia, became popular in the Victorian era because it was a plant that could survive in the horrible air produced by oil lamps, and so it became popular. It's a big shiny leaves, and it grows to enormous size. He says about it, he refers to this book he reads where Gordon has this obsession with the aspidistra. He hates it. It's everywhere. It's always put out for. It's a kind of an emblem of respectability that the middle class is attached to. Orwell says, it was about this time that he came across The Ragged Trousered Philanthropists, which is a book, and read about the starving carpenter who pawns everything but sticks to his aspidistra. The aspidistra became a sort of symbol for Gordon after that. The aspidistra, flower of England. It ought to be on our coat of arms instead of the lion and the unicorn. There will be no revolution in England while there are aspidistras in the windows. And to Rosemary's shock and, seemingly genuine dismay, because he's talked so much shit about aspidistras throughout the whole time they've known each other, he insists on buying an aspidistra and keeping it, tending to it well and showing it off in the window at the end.
Yes. Which for the reader, again, is like a very surprising about face that Gordon has taken, because the aspidistra as a symbol has been like really sort of like hammered home again and again throughout the novel as a sort of like symbol of disgusting, like lower and middle class perseverance in the face of the awfulness of capitalism.
I was trying to think of like what would be a comparable item today. And it might be something like in America, at least, like in like non-urban America, it might be something like even just like the lawn.
Sure.
Like something that's like, it doesn't serve any real function, but it's important that it's important for your presentation as a respectable household.
Yeah. I think that's pretty good. It doesn't quite have the sort of like,
it's not just
clinging to life aspect of the aspidistra, like
because he's at one point he says, like, with despair, he says the aspidistra was the tree of life,
right?
I think my personal aspidistra is the minivan, which I've hated since I was a child and now drive one and hate it. It's like a pretty intense fight that they have about it, where she says, no, of course we're not going to get an aspidistra, and he prevails and gets one. Oh, and just to elaborate a little bit, when he goes back to the New Albion, the PR place, Rosemary has like really put herself out there to get him the job back, and he has been basically he has had a standing offer to come back there for a while, and he's refused to, because
he was a really good writer of ad copy, it turns out.
Yeah. That's at the end we hear when he starts writing ad copy, he did it very well. He did it far better than he had ever done anything else in his life. Mr. Warner gave golden reports of him. There was no doubt about Gordon's literary ability. He could use words with the economy that is only learned by years of effort. So perhaps his long, agonizing struggles to be a writer had not been wasted after all. So I read the whole ending passage in one go, sitting at the dog park, which is its own weird emblem of the middle class, and just had such a strong reaction. But I want to hear yours first.
Man, I let me start by reading something on the back of my edition of
I wonder if we have the same one. I wonder, because I underlined a passage on the back of mine. So please, yeah.
So according to Harcourt, this book is, quote, a poignant and ultimately hopeful look at class and society. Keep the Aspidistra Flying pays tribute to the stubborn virtues of ordinary people who keep the aspidistra flying.
I have like scratched because it's a shiny back. I have scratched in with the tip of a ballpoint pen a line underneath "ultimately hopeful."
This book like has nothing but contempt for the ordinary people who keep the aspidistra flying. Including Gordon in this novel is treated with disgust and contempt. Rosemary is maybe an exception because she's this sort of like,
she
again,
seems to have a really
implausible saint.
Yeah.
But everyone else,
he makes her. I mean, he makes her when she tells him she's pregnant, and she says, "Well, I don't know if you can't marry me, then I can't afford to have a baby." And he says, "What? You would have an abortion?" And she says, "Well, if I can't have the baby, okay." And so he makes her promise to have the baby no matter what before he decides whether or not he wants to marry her. And so she, as you said, she is really an improbable saint. But I think she does still come off as having basically a heart of gold. But apart from her, most everyone is sort of awful.
So that is one thing that's wrong about that passage on the back of the book. Ultimately hopeful. I mean, definitely not. But I do think it's sort of complex. I think that, and it makes this book pretty interesting it made this book more satisfying to me than it maybe otherwise would have been.
Totally.
If it had a really bleak ending or a sort of less complex happy ending, a less complicated happy ending. Part of Gordon's sort of change in attitude is this sort of realization once Rosemary becomes pregnant that to reject money is to sort of step outside the stream of life, at least in today's society. And so by rejecting money, he's just like not participating in the world, in life as it exists for us today. And there's something about that which felt sort of true to me. You can't reject money and still expect to sort of like participate in the world in any sort of full and meaningful way. On the other hand, I think there's like a deep irony to Comstock's change of attitude over the last couple of chapters, and something sort of chilling about his like wholesale rejection of poetry and embrace of public relations, which throughout the book have been sort of like counterpoised as these two sort of like two different ways words can be put to use to have an effect on people.
There is a lot of like talk that I take to be fairly genuine about how advertising is toxic, is like bad for society and the world. At the end, he even refers to, he says like the advertising slogan he helps come up with, the goal that they had for it was that it would rankle in the public consciousness like a poisoned arrow. And that is like, there's a lot of talk of advertising. There's a lot of quoted, advertising slogans, and it is pretty convincingly presented as being like an active bad.
Absolutely. And everyone at the PR firm has this completely cynical attitude towards what they're doing.
Yeah.
They all sort of understand that they're in a toxic business, which like rings true to my experience with like people adjacent to that world. My own work is adjacent to that world sometimes, and I can recognize that sort of attitude, and it feels bad. It feels bad to be participating in that sort of game. I think there's like a pretty deep irony to Gordon's re-entering that world and rejecting art. It's almost as if the novel seems to be saying that like there is no place for poetry and art at all in today's world. It simply like can't exist within the sort of confines that have been established.
Because you're right that like what is not really explored, but is almost taken as a given that so by the time he's down in the, ghost kingdom where he's just working the shit job and living in squalor. At that point, he has already given up writing poetry. He carries around the incomplete draft of his poem in his pocket, but he's not even writing at all at that point. He's so demoralized, he's sort of given up. And then when he hears from Rosemary that she's pregnant, we're told that the feeling, there's a little bit of deliberation, but that basically the feeling he experiences is relief. That there's a sense that he's sort of allowed to give up this fight or whatever it is. And then he throws the draft of the poem into a sewer grate, and totally gives up poetry. Like it's not like he tinkers with poetry on the side, or he completely leaves it behind entirely.
Yes.
Which like I saw the line ultimately hopeful and kind of read that sentence on the back of the book before I had finished it. And I thought, oh,
Yeah.
I guess somehow he writes poems at the end. Like, I guess somehow there's some poems happening at the end.
Right.
And of course that's not the case at all. But then
Right. And the other thing is there's nothing about this world which they're entering into, this sort of middle class life, which has been presented in a positive light for the entire novel. Everything about it seems ugly and terrible in the novel's point of view.
Yeah.
So for them to suddenly take the step towards that life, and for us to imagine that as something positive seems wrong.
So I thought about two different possible readings of this ending, and I still don't like. Part of what made me I got really angry and really confused, and I think like you, I left the book feeling so much more satisfied than I think I would if like Rosemary had left him and he'd just sunk into total obscurity and depression,
which is what I was expecting would happen.
Right. That
was the trajectory of the book. It was, yeah.
Yeah.
I would not have been surprised if that had happened.
No, it was for being an incredibly conventional turn of events, it's really genuinely surprising when it happens in the book.
Yes.
I did not expect it. But so I was thinking about like, if my dad read this book, or if like any of my uncles, or probably like in fairness to him, like my stepdad, like most men I know of his generation, like educated, thoughtful, intelligent, book reading men, the response to Gordon would 100% be, well, he's a fool and an asshole, which he clearly is. Like he clearly is like self-destructive and obstinate and kind of awful throughout most of the book. But that at the end, I think like, my dad would say like, oh, he just obviously does what he should have done all along. And like, it's just a book about him, about like it taking him a long right. time to make the obviously correct decision. And then he is good at this and he should get paid. He should be good at it. He should get paid for being good at it. And he can have a good life with his family. And that's what should happen. Like this is the only thing that would keep this from being a traditionally happy ending from his perspective, I think would be that like there was no legitimate conflict all along, except like him being a stubborn jerk. Mm-hmm. And like there's a certain truth to that. Like I can see that point, and it is especially weird to me that it just like he can't take the middle class job and write poems. Like he already wasn't writing poems when he was in his worst, in poverty before that. But then the other reading of this ending that I couldn't help but think about was as a parallel to 1984.
Oh, that's interesting. How so?
So 1984, and that I believe that was published in the late 40s. I think it was like he like was writing it in 1948 and he switched the years around. But he so it's a good bit after this. The protagonist of that book is Winston, I think is his name.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And he lives under this brutal totalitarian regime that watches everything he does and controls everything he does, and all language is restricted in this really crippling way. And he, over the course of the book, he gets to know, he finds little ways to live slightly outside of the view of Big Brother. He finds little slices of privacy, here and there, and he develops a relationship and a love affair with this woman. I think her name is, I want to say her name is Julia, which is the name of Gordon's sister, but I'm not sure. But he develops this love affair, and they seem to have like a really genuine bond and really care for each other. And the two of them join what seems to be basically like a resistance to the regime, and they kind of commit themselves to fighting against this horrible and devastatingly repressive government. And then in the end, they're captured, they're found out, they're separated and tortured, and he's subjected to this really horrible psychological and physical torture. And finally, the end of that torture is that he is, his will is totally broken until he agrees that 2 + 2 = 5, and he even finally agrees to totally betray Julia. Basically, he's threatened with the most horrible fear he can imagine, and the only way he's able to get out of it is by finally begging them to do it to her instead. And then cruelly, they don't kill him, but they finally release him. And there's a moment when he and Julia, or whatever her name is, meet up in the world outside, and they're both just completely broken people. And anything they might have had before has been totally shattered, and they go on living as, newly rehabilitated subjects in this nightmare totalitarian world. And reading into this, I thought, is this sort of the same ending? Like, the marriage survives it, but like, is this? I mean, like, because I don't think this book I don't think Orwell was writing this book with my dad's perspective, which was just like, stubborn son of a bitch, you should just take the advertising job. Like that doesn't, I don't think that's quite, I mean, I think he does seem to have as you say, like he has real anger and contempt for capitalism in this book. And the money god, like Gordon's criticisms of the money god are at times kind of juvenile, but they seem to be basically like right. At least like the book seems to agree with him in that.
Yes. I mean, Gordon seems like a vessel for Orwell to maybe slightly exaggerate what are probably his own views on capitalism and ads and money, etc.
Yeah. So what do you, how can
no,
you
I think
this?
that's an interesting reading. I mean, it's, and I think that this book can take on like a darker cast from the perspective of 1948, or partly because of what you just outlined in the plot of 1984, and partly too because there's some really interesting stuff at the beginning of this book where Gordon is sort of like free associating in his mind, looking at these ads and imagining like warplanes flying over London. And this is 1934, 1935.
He fantasizes about
fantasizing
this.
about him. Like he finds himself desiring it to happen.
Yeah.
Which turns out to be sort of prophetic, and it means something different maybe for these two people to enter into a normal middle class life in 1936 from a post World War II perspective than it does from a pre World War II perspective. But even without that, I agree. I think there's something sort of chilling and sinister in the ending of the novel. At the same time, it's not like obviously so. It's like it's ambivalent enough for your dad's imagined reading to be sort of like understandable, at least,
Right. Yeah, I was, and it makes me wonder now. I haven't seen it, but there's apparently like moderately successful romantic comedy from some decades ago. It takes a phrase from within the book where he and Rosemary have this, they bicker with each other in a playful way, and he refers to it as a merry war. And so this movie is called The Merry War.
I saw that on Wikipedia. Yeah.
Yeah, I have not seen it, but I'm assuming it has a happy romantic comedy ending, which would line up with the book, but that I'm assuming it's sold as a happy ending in that case. And I could imagine people, like, it's something I've been thinking about because like Brian has this obsession with wish fulfillment in novels, and like people seem to want wish fulfillment. Like it seems to be, even sophisticated novels seem to like often success seems not, dependent upon, but like tied to an element of wish fulfillment in the plot. And even if it's a kind of a Freudian perverse wish fulfillment. And so I thought about this as being an example of like having your cake and eating it too, like writing a novel where there is wish fulfillment, like there is a happy ending, but of course, like with a little bit of perspective, the happy ending is sort of all wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. That's right. And I think the title maybe is a bit of a hat tip towards that darker reading too. Keep the Aspidistra flying is a slogan, right? It's like that itself reads like a bit of ad copy, which I think, suggests that we're not meant to understand that as a sort of unironic rah rah sort of thing, but as
no, yeah. Despite what the back cover would tell you.
Yeah, but as something, really sort of dark. The two things which I thought were great in the depiction of a poet were, we get to see Gordon actually at work on his poetry pretty early on.
Yeah.
And that's just like a delightful chapter. He gets like, he's like, I really need to do some work tonight. No, I'm not going to do it. I want to go out for a drink. All right, I'll sit down and do some work. And he sits down and does like maybe an hour's worth of work on this long, unfinishable poem, London Pleasures. And it consists of him like crossing out a couple of lines. Yeah. And he's like really happy with it. It fills him with pride. And then like 5 minutes later, I can't remember what happens, but it's the mail arrives and he's hoping that he will have heard either from Rosemary or from a literary magazine, because he sent out a couple of poems to literary magazines. And I think he doesn't hear from either of them. And then he goes back to his poem and he's like, this is the worst bullshit I've ever read in my life. Like, I'm wasting my life. That like felt, really well done and recognizable, just in terms of that it's oscillation between this is like a masterpiece and this is a travesty.
Right.
But the other thing
one pops up on your Gmail tab and you click on it and it's like an Amazon ad. Like, God damn it.
Right. But the other thing, which I thought was really great, was just him waiting for those responses and eventually receiving the responses from literary magazines. Yeah. At first he gets a rejection, and he's like he's feels this sort of like anger towards the rejection note and the editors and the whole like world, which everyone feels when they get a rejection note like that. And then he gets the acceptance and he goes totally insane. Like he gets the $50 check and he's like, he loses his mind for a night and is just like ecstatic in a way that ends up being really self-destructive.
And is sort of miserable most, like he has this really, like there's this brief moment early on where he's getting drunk with his cab driver. And that seems to be when he's sort of at his peak. And from then on, basically like the whole night is just Ravelston and Rosemary saying, let's not do this. Please stop drinking. Please stop spending money. And he just gets angrier and angrier and just keeps spending money and getting drunker.
Yeah. And there's a moment where he orders the second bottle of wine. And that's sort of like a hinge moment for the evening where like he sort of knows he shouldn't order the second bottle. That's going to tip it over into something pretty dark. And he does it anyway. And that's a great sort of like, a great sort of depiction of like a celebration. I don't know, just sort of the hollowness that accompanies that sort of like feeling of being accepted, getting something accepted. It's really spot on and awful.
There's a little moment that I thought was great because it felt like a very able skewering of this podcast, among other things. It says when they're sitting at the table talking shit with Ravelston and Rosemary, it says, "It was great fun. It is fun when you have good food and good wine inside you to demonstrate that we live in a dead and rotting world." He was being witty at the expense of modern literature. They were all being witty. With the fine scorn of the unpublished, Gordon knocks down reputation after reputation.
Which again, not unpublished. He's written Mice. That's Mice received 13 reviews.
13 reviews, including one of the Times Literary Supplement. But he feels unpublished.
Feels unpublished. Another great detail about Mice, which I'm just remembering, is that it was only published because Ravelston, his only friend, who's this editor of the literary magazine, like talked to the publisher and was like, maybe you can publish this book by this friend of mine, which Gordon doesn't know about. And so he's able to feel this sort of mix of pride and self-disgust that one feels when one publishes a book.
Yeah.
Rather than just the self-disgust.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And you get the impression that like much of, if not all of his publishing success has thus far, apart from California, has been because of these sort of quiet favors done behind his back. Though again, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, we see a finished poem of Gordon's. Mm-hmm. What did you make of that poem, and what do you think we're supposed to make of it?
Yeah, he's working on a poem throughout the whole first half of the book, and we see little bits and pieces, and there are these kind of wonderful moments where, like, in a way that just totally ring true, he's got a couple lines. Here's a bit very early on. Outside, the slimy street looked gray and drear. From somewhere around the corner came the clatter of hooves, a cold, hollow sound. Caught by the wind, the dark columns of smoke from the chimneys veered over and rolled flatly down the sloping roofs. Ah! And so he's got the first couple lines, but then he's trying to finish the stanza. Sharply the menacing wind sweeps over the bending poplars newly bare, and the dark ribbons of the chimneys veer downward tumpty-tumpty, something like murky air. And and this is good, but the impulse faded. His eye fell again upon the ad posters across the street. So that felt very true, and you see him sort of slowly, bit by bit, adding to this, and he's using a lot of adverbs, and it feels forced at times, but you finally see this finished product, and you don't actually you don't hear anything more about it, like whether he submits it somewhere, whether Ravelston is going to take it, or anything's going to happen with it. It's more than, it's like 2/3 of the way through the book. You finally get this poem, and it's like a page-long poem. It has that same beginning, and it's all about the money god. And he has this sort of terrible thing with Rosemary, where, as we said, he's going to go have sex with her out in the countryside, but because of the contraception thing, they don't. And then she even offers to again, but he feels so diminished by this question of money, that money has come between them, and that's what sort of inspires him with the end of the poem. He has this litany of all the things that money does. The Lord of all, the money god, who rules us blood and hand and brain, who gives the roof that stops the wind and giving takes away again. And he goes down and he lists thing after thing after thing the money god does, who this, who that, who the other. And he ends, who binds with chains the poet's wit, the navvy's strength, the soldier's pride, and lays the sleek estranging shield between the lover and his bride, which is a line I think he's gently borrowing that from Housman, who has a great poem called When I Watch the Living Meet, and it ends, and it's all about the pain of being alive, and then the comparative peace and coldness of death. But the end of the poem is, lovers lying two and two ask not whom they sleep beside, and the bridegroom all night through never turns him to the bride. So I think the ending of the poem is maybe the best part of it. It's definitely got a lot of nice stuff in it. I particularly like there's all these references to Drages, which is like a store where people get furniture on layaway. It's like shitty furniture that looks nice enough that you feel respectable. And he has a line, they think of rent, rates, season tickets, insurance, coal, the skivvy's wages, boots, school bills, and the next installment upon the 2 twin beds from Drages. That's good. I mean, some of the poem is pretty good. Some of it is a clumsy, but I think it's a pretty decent little competent poem that's super, super cynical about money. And I kind of feel like the poem gives pretty genuine voice to what I suspect Orwell believes, and I wonder if that's not why we don't hear from it again. Mm-hmm. That the beginning is not great, and there are definitely some chunks that are shaggy, but it's definitely not like a satirically bad poem.
No, it didn't strike me either as like a laughably bad poem. But I wanted to get your take on. I couldn't tell if we were supposed to understand it as obviously mediocre, or I agree. I saw some like clunky lines, but some like nice passages too. It just seems like a weird sort of like true to life mixed bag of like someone who was publishing poetry in 1935.
Totally. I mean, what I kind of wonder is like in a culture where like verse is more, where like everybody has a little bit of training in verse and there's a lot more metrical rhyming poetry being published. I think it's probably, it would, in some ways it would stand out less because it's basically like competent with a couple nice moments.
Sure.
So my guess it probably is read as, at the time was read as just sort of mediocre. I think compared to so much just like inert nonsense or whining or stream of consciousness that one sees in poetry magazines today, like reading it, they're like, oh, okay. Like if I got that as a submission, I'd be like, huh, all right. Shit, okay. But yeah, I suspect at the time it was,
here's $50.
Right, here's $50, which like, though clearly, the inflation has changed what that means. Like, getting $50 for a poem today is still a really
Still
nice
a lot.
surprise.
Still a
Still
lot.
like, holy shit. I'm going to go buy a new suit and take my friends out for a drink. Yeah. So, all right. So this is a book about a guy who is both smart and eloquent, as well as being kind of an idiot and like definitely way too navel gazing. I think that much it shares with your really delightful book, The Bachelor, which part of what I enjoyed about it, I think I mentioned this to Brian, was that it's so well written, and it's all written in the voice of the protagonist. Like, he is so smart and he is such a brilliant talker, but he also is sort of a fool. Like, he makes kind of foolish mistake after foolish mistake. In his case, it seems to be like definitely money is not, like, money plays a role in The Bachelor, but I think it seems like he's more of a fool for love than a fool for money. He's like less morally constipated than Gordon, but he's
figured out ways to sort of to skate by, to sort of elude that world, at least for the time being. I don't think that, and I think that is something that a lot of writers are able to figure out how to do, not forever, but for a little while, especially when they're younger and don't have families to take care of.
Well, and as in your book, like, sex can be a big part of that. Like, sex and the promise of sex can be like not at all unconnected. Like, there's like joking about, or in some cases unfair joking about people sleeping their way here and there, but like for writers, like who you are having sex with or might have sex with can be like really, really integrally connected to like how you live. You know?
Talk more about that. What do you mean?
Well, I mean, I think like that's, people date and live together. There are people who, I think like part of the whole weird economy that exists between older writers and younger writers is like older writers have prestige and they have sometimes money. Sometimes it's institutional money rather than personal money, but they are able to supply the booze and throw the party. And the younger people bring a little bit of life and vitality as well as attractiveness. Like there's, like Sewanee, a big writers conference I've been to a couple times, like is sort of, notoriously a place where there's a pretty like direct exchange of like hoary, wrinkled, overweight, old prestige and, hot, nubile, young, like obscurity. Like there's like those things clash pretty directly. I think a milder version of that happens in MFA programs. I think like for so many people who are able to say like make a living in publishing or not make a living, live in publishing or live in writing, so many of those people have family money. So many of those people have a spouse who can support them. So like I think there are a lot of different versions of this, and like whether it's a permanent arrangement or in the case of a couple, and usually it's younger women and older men, not always, but like I've known a handful of people who were young women who hooked up with much older, much more successful men who helped establish their careers. And in some cases, then it was a temporary arrangement. In other cases, less so. But like it's not, it's taboo to, there are shitty ways to talk about that are unfair. And usually, as with these things, they tend to be unfair to women, but also like you're kidding yourself if you think it has no role to play. Like that's, I am very happy with my marriage and my family, but like, it's not meaningless that like my wife makes substantial money. Like she makes money in a way that I have never made in my life. And like, that's not insignificant in like how I'm able to be somebody who like writes and even does a podcast like this.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And so, the protagonist of my book ends up sort of, getting together for a while with this older woman who is not a writer or really even connected to the writing world, but she does have a lot more money than he does. And through her is able to get hooked up with this sort of house sitting gig at this palatial mountaintop house for several months, where he's able to, where he essentially is being paid to live in this beautiful place and write. And so, yeah, that plays out in my book. It's not something that I think is talked about or thought about much, but maybe a stream that runs underneath the decision making of the characters.
Yeah, like I think that like that is Malm has a line in, I think it's in The Razor's Edge, where he talks about like how as a writer you can go to everybody's party, and it's partly because like in some cases you're like the middle class successful one in some parties, and then in other parties you're like the charming hobo, but you bring a little something to one group or another, and you, as with your protagonist, kind of skate by on that.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
For being a book that is largely a sort of a picaresque series of like failed or near missed love affairs, and then one like long and compelling and strange love affair, as well as being a book that is also a lot about TV in general and The Bachelor TV show specifically. Your book also includes an enormous amount of John Barrowman, which I loved. Like I ate up. But I'm curious, what I don't remember specifically when we were in grad school, you're having like any like special like thought or relationship to or interest in Barrowman or poetry at all beyond like the classes we taught. What's with John Barrowman?
Well, beyond the classes we taught, we were all experts in poetry when we taught those classes in grad school. So,
we were completely qualified.
I was completely fluent in all aspects of poetry from Homer up until contemporary times. I don't think I had really read much Barrowman at that point in my life. I'm an off and on reader of poetry and have been for a long time. No, I just, for whatever reason, picked up a used copy of the Dream Songs shortly before starting work on The Bachelor, and just found it amazing. Just really connected with it, and I don't know, just really found it sort of delightful in a way that I hadn't found reading poetry, I think, in quite a while. So I just picked up the Barrowman and sort of vibed with it. And then shortly thereafter, and this is really sort of the spark for including Barrowman in the novel, I read a biography of John Barrowman, which I thought was truly terrible. A truly embarrassingly, awfully written book. Such that I was like, it was.
I was going to say, you talk about the badness of, I'm assuming, this same biography in The Bachelor, yeah. And it is very funny. But just for listeners, what made it bad to your? Because I'm assuming you did. It wasn't that you had a deep knowledge of his biography that you were comparing it to, but that
no, it wasn't like I thought Barrowman did this, but it was bad in itself, and it was. I find this often when I don't read biography a bunch, but. And it's usually literary biography when I do. And I often feel some version of this feeling, but I felt it even more strongly reading this Barrowman biography, which is just the like utter presumptuousness of the author when talking about various stages, and especially like stages of sort of consciousness or emotions in the subject's life. Just the sort of like, based on whatever sort of research he did, some interviews, some reading through the diaries and letters and stuff, stating sort of with absolute authority, like Barrowman felt this at this point in his life, or Barrowman thought these things at this point in his life, or saying like, we can easily imagine that Barrowman felt these things as he read this letter from so-and-so, or like, it's not hard to imagine Barrowman thinking this as he was rejected by a million different magazines up until he was 35. Like, I don't know. And that feeling of sort of like the subject's not really being present in a biography feels sort of like more poignant to me when the subject is a writer, him or herself, where like you're reading this biography presumably because you've had some profound or near profound experience reading their work, and often that experience, you can feel like you're in really close contact, like closer contact than almost any other way of being in contact with someone. And then to have that rug sort of pulled out from underneath you, reading about this person is just like an interesting experience to me. And that felt like more intense when it's or I don't know, maybe more like symbolically potent when it's a poet.
Yeah, I think like my feeling reading about the lives of writers I've admired is often that I take a kind of consolation in the meaninglessness or the chaos of their lives. Like,
yeah,
very seldom is there not even like straightforward, but like credibly progressing story about like doing one thing to lead to another to get any, like there's seldom like any sense that this person made meaningful choices that advanced, his career or his work, or like led to anything in a predictable way or a reliable way. Like, so often it's just a series of fucking billiard balls and lightning strokes, and like nothing makes any sense, and everybody suffers, and like some good work comes out of it, but nobody can account for why or when. And then there's either a tragically quick or like repugnantly slow demise, and like, and then at the end we just sort of, we like return to the work again, and we still understand nothing.
Totally. And that was the case definitely reading this Berryman biography. And what's also the case is that we see these people making the compromises necessary to maintain any sort of artistic life at all, and sort of like often being tormented by those compromises, and
self-sabotaging in ways that like,
and self-sabotaging
are tragic, but then often as not, like ineffectual. Like Delmore Schwartz self-sabotages and like just completely slides into absolute like squalor and insanity. And then Lowell and Berryman also self-sabotage, but somehow manage to get out okay, at least for a long time.
Yeah, and Berryman does his best work when he's like most ragingly an alcoholic.
Yeah. All really, really poorly behaved people. Like the only well-behaved people are the non-writer wives. It seems like,
yes,
in a lot of these stories, the writer wives, and are also often terrible people. But yeah, I'm always ambivalent about writers' biographies for that reason. That I just feel, if the best outcome is that I feel like, oh, they didn't understand anything either.
Yeah.
And it doesn't, and there's no real lesson to learn.
Yeah.
It's like the opposite of reading those like Rich Dad Poor Dad or like entrepreneur biographies. Like the opposite of those biographies where you're like, oh, this is how you do it. It's like nothing is how you do it. Nothing makes sense. Who knows?
Yeah. And I think the best biographies portray that. They just lay it all out for you to receive that sort of honest message. And the bad ones try to overlay that chaos with a sort of order that's not actually there in the lives of the subjects. I don't read a lot of poetry, and I think the reason that I don't is because I like to be absorbed into the art that I'm experiencing. And so that often takes the form of reading a novel, but it can also mean listening to music or watching a movie. And with poetry, it just, I think, probably for most people, it's just like harder to get that feeling of getting like swept away in it.
Well,
yeah, we should all be reading a lot more poetry all the time. Maybe,
but I'm so resistant to that kind of, like, that's the like either the text or the subtext of like nearly every poetry podcast, for instance. And it's just so unconvincing.
No, it is. And I don't mean that, but I do think like, I don't know, how can poetry just be like a presence in our lives without it dominating your life in the way that it does if you're a poet? It's like, how can that happen? How can we make that happen as a society?
Yeah, I mean, there's like, I hate to say like the writer's almanac, but like in terms of people's daily lives, like that's one of the better, like,
I used to produce that show and write for it.
I actually had forgotten about it. I didn't mention it for that reason, because I did know that about you, but I totally forgot about that just now.
Yeah. And that was a period where poetry was much more central to my life, because I presented a selection of poems to Garrison Keillor to choose from to read it when he was recording that week's batch of poems for the show. So I rifled through like best American poetries the past 20 years and like the pretty big but not super big poetry library that we had in the office, and just like photocopied some of the poems that I thought would read well on that show. And in that respect, I guess I was at once, this is like for 1 year, right when I was out of college, I had a role in which I was sort of an arbiter in the poetry world.
What were your criteria? Just, you said you thought they would
read Will well. Garrison like this and want to read this poem. It was more about like trying to match the selection of his taste. Yeah. And also like, will it connect with the average NPR listener who's sort of distracted driving to work? Like, it can't be super complicated. It's best if it's narrative and understandable, not super fragmented sentences.
Definitely. But there is also, for the NPR listener, there is a little bit of, I think, having been an NPR listener and a subscriber for a long time, there is an element to NPR listeners of wanting to feel like they're in the know or in on something, or they're like in a way you wouldn't do just Carl Sandburg or Ogden Nash wouldn't do it, right? Like, they'd be totally understandable, but you need a little je ne sais quoi, right? You need something to make it feel like, I'm glad I got some poetry today.
Absolutely, yeah. And like poets like Mary Oliver recurred again and again. Billy Collins, another favorite.
Yeah.
Poets like that, if I can group them together, were pretty popular.
But they also, like, they tend to supply a little touch of some mystery or some something. They're not just writing jokes, and they're not just writing stories.
Right.
That was my conversation with Andrew Palmer. Again, he is the author of The Bachelor, and you can find him on you can find him on Twitter at Andrew Palmer, AndrewPalmer. Andrew Palmer. For those of you who have not already heard it, here is an excerpt from my most recent conversation with Alice on The Secret Show.
I still have doubt. I still think, well, you don't 100% know what was going on with that person.
Yeah. Of course.
Maybe you read that wrong. Maybe you read that situation wrong. Maybe you're wrong. So there's a confidence piece to it as well. There's a need to feel, for me, to feel completely confident, more than confident, before I feel like I can be completely honest.
Sure. Yeah. I get that. And that seems fair and reasonable. Like, there's like a type of HBO comedy / BBC drama that Joanna and I watch a lot. And on those, there tends to be, like, there are a couple things that happen. Like, one is that in the BBC dramas, the rule is all white men must be evil, stupid, weak, or all of the above, right? And then in the HBO comedies, often it's like white people are clueless and insensitive, or men are clueless and insensitive and are basically the butt of the joke. And when I see those, I think like, okay, Like, I get it. Like, there's a need to, like, I don't think those are perfectly accurate representations of like all white people, but I also think like there's a need for some people to be able to like laugh at this. There's a need for some people to be able to like make fun of like groups of people that have driven them crazy. And like, particularly if you're among women and you're making cracks about the men in your lives, like there's a certain degree of like necessary catharsis. Like, you know, Insecure is not a show about like validating the white male experience. It's a show about like black women professionals in California trying to make it, and like if and when men or white people come into their lives, often they're sort of the gag. And like that's fine, because like there's a lot of genuine frustration that people who relate to that show presumably have with the people who get made fun of in the show. And like, great, fine, perfect. I don't think that means that you, like, if you participate in jokes at the expense of like men or the whatever, like, I don't think that means that you need to have total confidence that everything you say is totally true about men. I think it just means that what is true and what you do have confidence in is the experience of women who can laugh at that joke. Right? Who say like, oof, I know how that feels. Like I saw a great line on Twitter today that was I can't remember who it was, but I'll see if I can find it. But it was a woman said, no surprises that have ever been as great as the surprise of a man hearing his wife's plans for the second time. And I thought like, that's a good joke. Like Joanna does like gets on me about like my surprise at things she's told me before. And like, I don't know if it's always a fair joke, but like it definitely nails the experience of women who must be frustrated at that experience. Like that's what it's getting at, more so than it's not necessarily even saying anything particularly insightful about men. It's saying something about the experience of women, right? Like, oh my God, I recognize that. I feel that way, right? That's who it's for. Yeah. So I think like when I make fun of somebody on the show or I make fun of somebody's writing, it's not because I wish that person any harm. It's not because I think that I'm necessarily right. I think like often I'm not right. And I like, luckily people will tell me when I'm wrong. And I will learn more. And like, I totally expect to read work by Alyssa Gabbert and think like, oh wow, she's smarter than I thought. Though I already think she's smart. I just think she's like an odd mind who's often right and often wrong. I expect to read writing, like I wouldn't be surprised if I read something by Ada Limon and they're like, oh shit, all right, that's pretty good. Or something by Garth Greenwell, it's something by any number of people. But what's also true is that particularly if you are already successful, already celebrated, already in demand, then like you get the chance to go out in public and say a bunch of shit. And a lot of that shit is going to end up being dumb. And so when lots of people who are not in demand, who are not widely published, who are not listened to, read you already celebrated person saying your dumb shit in public, they're going to be frustrated as all get out, right? They're going to say, oh my God, I can't believe I'm listening to another one of these top 10, celebrated award-winning people saying yet another dumb thought about poetry in public. And that's the big thought that's set out there in public for everybody to listen to about poetry. And we all are supposed to nod at it. And so what I'm saying is not so much like, let me tell you what's true about your soul, famous person who's speaking in public. What I'm saying is, I also wince at that, and I want to give everybody an opportunity to laugh at it. Because I know we're all frustrated by having to hear that shit. So I don't think it's necessarily like identifying any deep truth about what's being said. It's identifying a truth about the experience of encountering all that, the experience of being an underling having to listen to it, or something to that effect.
Fuck.
By the way, I looked up because I told Jonathan gave me grief for making fun of Alyssa Gabbert. And he said, I just think if that happened to me, if some like corner of the internet were saying like, I'm, so-and-so, you're a moron, I would be really offended and angry. And I thought like, if some little corner of the internet was getting together and reading shit I had written and telling each other that I was a moron, I would be so flattered. I would be
really?
So flattered.
Really?
Because they're fucking good Lord, because that means they're reading it. And then I realized that has actually happened already. Like that has happened. Oh, yeah? Here, I'll pull it up because I was going to do that. But yeah, I'll pull it up because I was looking at it the other day. So, 10 years ago maybe, I wrote an essay called Why Poems Don't Make Sense. And
Oh yes, I read this.
and I have like mixed feelings about it now, but there were some people responded to it nicely. Some people also really fucking hated it. Trey on realpants.com wrote, I guess in a way it's appropriate that he tried to write about nonsense and ended up writing nonsense. Eldon Spangle wrote, fuck that noise. What was the one really? Surly Ray Jepson, nice handle, wrote, didn't make it past the thesis sentence. And Publishing Genius, a small literary press based in my hometown, wrote, please read this asshole bullshit, tell me what it says, then shoot me in the fucking face. And then linked to my article. So I think like I was flattered. And in fact, like Paramanand Singh wrote a really thoughtful piece in detail about exactly how wrong I was. And I like wrote him a note. It's like, this is a smart essay. I still disagree with you, but like, how could you not be flattered by that? Like if some small group of people cares enough to like talk to each other about how much they think you're wrong, then like, holy shit, that's such a compliment. Are you actually Surly Ray Jepson? Is this what I'm going to find out?
I fucking wish. What an amazing handle.
That is, it's pretty good.
I think you are right objectively, but I'm with Jonathan. I would just crumble if I got that kind of response to something that I had written, unless, and I think this is the difference with the piece that you wrote, you're kind of going out there swinging.
I was kind of asking for it, you're saying?
Oh my God! None of this is usable. None of this is usable.